All right. I am here with Sascha Mornell, and he is currently the co-founder and CEO of Get My Boat. How's it going, Sascha?
Good, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to really unpack multiple successes here. But before we get to that, let's talk about how you started. What's your origin story and how did you get into business?
Great question. It could probably take the entire half an hour, so I'll try and make it relatively brief. I grew up in Northern California and went to school primarily on the West Coast initially. I didn't know that I was interested in building businesses and entrepreneurship originally. Um, my path took me to Europe as a bartender for a while, but I wound up in Japan actually selling ice cream for a joint venture between a Japanese conglomerate and Dreyer's Ice Cream. And at that point, I started doing international business. I started doing marketing, and I was looking to make a career change. I went back to business school and realized that this was something I absolutely loved. Um, Worked very briefly in what most people would think of, and I did as well, as a dream job in doing management for the National Basketball Association, actually in New York City, with um, a rotation for a year. And then they were going to send me to Asia to run the Asian Pacific region for the National Basketball Association. It wasn't right for me. I'll just leave it at that. A dream job was not actually a dream. And this was back in the late 90s. I joined my first startup, a technology startup. At this time, domain names were just becoming fashionable as a way for people to get on the internet. And I joined the startup and took it public. I was the first employee there. They took venture capital. We took it public in 2000. And it was a great business. It's still around today, register.com. And I realized at that point, building a company from zero to, at that point, it was 100 million, was something I truly loved doing. I loved the leadership role. I loved the entrepreneurial role, building something from scratch. I argue that I wish I was a painter, but I don't have the talent. So business is my canvas, if you will, and creating something from nothing was really something I was passionate about. And then I've started two companies since then, Facile, for about 15, 16 years. It was a federal contractor, did a lot of security work for the US government, much of which I can't talk about. But we had an exit there as well. And then most recently, as you mentioned, Get My Boat, where I'm co-founder and CEO. And we've also had a recent majority acquisition by a
Nice.
strategic investor there.
Nice. So a lot of different spaces. What was the first startup that you joined as employee one? What was that industry?
It was called register.com, and it
Okay.
was domain name registration.
Okay. Okay.
So back in the 90s, it was a monopoly held by Network Solutions. We were the first company to deregulate the industry.
Got it.
And it was a
Got
very
it.
exciting time.
Very cool. And I like going across all these different types of industries specifically because you've had like ultra scale in multiple different industries to exits, and it's fun to kind of see what type of similarities could go across all of these. So this is kind of a unique conversation. But with the exit of Facile, let's talk a little bit about that. How did that begin? And how big was the team? And what was that story of starting up?
So this is Facile. This was a second startup. This was after I was fortunate with the register.com IPO to have some financial means at that point. Certainly not enough to retire at one point in time, potentially, but that changed in a very quick time. But I was very fortunate at that time. I had met my business partner, who is still my business partner, over a 22-year period, which I think is incredibly important for entrepreneurs to know and have. And we wanted to do something together. And at the time, 2001, 2002, there was a downturn in tech, for those of you that were not around or are too young to remember that. And so we were looking at areas to really do something unique, and realized that he had some expertise in doing technology with the Defense Department. And that was how Facile started. We bootstrapped it. We didn't want to take venture capital at the time. We used our own funds. And fast forward through a lot of and very painful periods, over 15 years, we had grown the company basically zero, he and I, to about 1,000 employees, 150 million revenue. We had installed a complete C-suite at that time, a CEO, a CFO, chief operating officer, variety of VPs. And he and I were looking to do something different out of the business. There were a variety of times that we tried to exit, and this will come towards the end of the conversation. I'll talk about lessons learned. And at the time, valuations were not in the government contracting space, were not similar to other tech companies. And so the multiples were not, and given how profitable the company was, it didn't make sense to sell in the open market. So what we did, we took an interim step. We sold the company to the employees. At that time, as an exit, we retained some ownership, and we did some founder financing. And then a couple of years later, a private equity firm acquired the company, and that completed our full exit at that time.
Nice, very nice. I haven't quite heard many stories around selling to employees. How does that work exactly? Is it the people that have options, they just can kind of increase the amount, and then how does that work?
So it's unusual here in Silicon Valley, particularly in technology companies and options. So Facile was privately owned, and my business partner and I own 50-50 of the company. Yeah, just over 50%. I own just under. And because valuations weren't where we wanted them to be, we figured, look, the people that have put the most work into this are the employees. And so they should get an opportunity to see some upside if they can grow the company. And so we set a valuation. It was independently determined. And the company was bought, so to speak. The company bought our shares and then distributes them over time to the various employees at various
Wow.
levels. But then when the private equity firm acquired Facile after that, then all the employees that got paid at various levels, all of their options or restricted stock accelerated because they had been on a stock option plan. So it was all accelerated, and it was a very nice feel-good story, if you will, from the perspective that those that were with us a long time got rewarded, and we were able to exit the business, which was ultimately what we wanted to do.
Yeah, that's really cool. I haven't quite heard of it laid out like that, because the private equity coming in and giving all the people, all the employees that had ownership, their exit afterwards is quite unique. So let's talk about that business and the KPIs that you were tracking. Obviously, it was government contracting, so there's things that, of course, we can't discuss. But what types of things were important to the business that kind of quantified success?
So the government contracting business is a unique animal, and I would love to say that the government buys the best product, best service, et cetera. I don't think that that's actually the case based on the experience that we had. And the larger you get, the more difficult it gets, actually, and that's why you see a lot of M&A in the government contracting space. The most important, because the government regulates your price structure, every bid you have has to break down your cost structure, and they have to approve that. The types of contracts, some are based on time and materials, some are based on fixed firm fixed price, et cetera. The main KPI actually that we learned as we were transitioning and getting larger was how can we bring the cost of our proposals to the government down? And that's like the one lesson in government contracting. You have to do a ton of proposals. And it'll be interesting to see how AI disrupts this. But that's where the government determines your experience, your expertise, your knowledge of their particular agency, your knowledge of the particular problem. But it's an extremely expensive process, as you might imagine. You have to get a lot of technical help involved in these proposals. You need employees involved and writers involved. So we ultimately determined the most important metric was when you're competing for these contracts, how can you bring the price of your proposal down to the low cost leader, and still pump out a product. In this case, it's the proposal that is going to win a bid. And that was a big aha moment for us. And that's really was the overriding KPI.
Hmm. And I think shifting gears to the more recent
Sure.
acquisition, because we got so many successful business ventures here. I want to get to the most recent one so
Sure.
people can kind of understand what that process was like, because government contracting, as you said, is an animal on its own. And
Yes.
I don't know how many government contractors are listening to this and running a business in that space, but I think that kind of going from the register.com all the way up to the what you're working on now, it'd be interesting to see if we could nail down some similarities in terms of like what types of success you've seen. So what is the current business and what was that sort of exit leading up to?
Sure. So the current business is Get My Boat, and going back to which is basically an Airbnb or Uber for boats.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2012, 2013, my current business partner and I looked around, and Facile was more mature at this point. We're entrepreneurs at heart. What could we do that would take advantage of underutilized assets, much like Airbnb had, much like Uber had? And boats are a great underutilized asset that are incredibly expensive for people. And access was very low, incredibly fragmented market, no efficient marketplaces. Technology was not being used. So it would seem like a great platform for us to launch and connect people and boat owners, much like you see throughout the sharing economy and underutilized assets. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the brief background. Having had an IPO with taking venture capital, that was not something my business partner and I were interested in doing. We wanted to bootstrap, Get My Boat. And this is probably to your listeners that this was a true and is a true technology company. It's a marketplace, and based here in Silicon Valley. And so, given that we had a desire to bootstrap it, it limited certain options initially. We were open to strategic investment, and lo and behold, a company by the name of Yanmar, they are a huge Japanese, coming back to my origin, so to speak, my beginning of my career, was interested in investing in the company. And so they became an investor. I give this background because exits don't just happen, as you know, Steve. There's always a story behind it, and there's always a buildup behind it. And so, and one piece of advice I'd give is if you're just focused on the exit, then the journey itself and building a great business kind of gets lost. And I would always urge people to not focus on the exit, but rather focus on the process of building something great that people want and to use. So we accepted this strategic capital. Um, Hit COVID, as you've heard probably from other stories, business fell off a cliff for a couple of weeks, and I do mean just a couple of weeks, and then miraculously it started to pick up. In Florida, you're based in Florida. Florida was a big market for us, but boating turned out to be one of those experiences that people participated in the pandemic. You could
Mm-hmm.
drive to boats. Something like 90% of people are within 50 miles of some body of water here in the U.S. We're primarily U.S. based, and so we took off like a rocket, believe it or not, during COVID in the summer of 2020. And then there were some external, and again, this context is important in part of the exit. And so within this, we got a lot of interest in the company at that point in terms of funding it from venture capital, funding from strategics, potential acquisition. And that's when we started preparing for the exit, if you will. So, a couple things on that. Number one, in building your business, you should always be doing the right thing, so to speak, in terms of processes, procedures, documentation. How can you build a business that is repeatable and providing the best experience for employees? Generally, you can take that, put it down on paper, so to speak, or electronically. And that is a roadmap for any acquiring company to look at to get a sense of how how you run your business, so to speak. So we started doing that as the interest began. We started documenting everything we had. We created a data room so that we knew these requests coming in for information. We would just be able to update. Um, and then as the process got more serious and the interest increased and the numbers started coming in terms of what people were interested in, then at that point, this is the advice I give people on that, preparing for that exit. You need a very good law firm or lawyer at that point, and the type of lawyer or law firm matters, right? So, do you need a white shoe law firm? Pricing matters. How much can you afford? Most exits don't happen. So, how much are you going to actually invest in this? Or do you want somebody that's street savvy and really can be bare knuckles in a negotiation? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's important. Um, I mentioned getting a data room together. It's very easy to do that, very cheap with a box or Dropbox, just to start preparing that way. Um, I recommend that you have your financials reviewed or audited. Reviewed is a much simpler process and less expensive than audited, but you can. There's a variety of firms out there that can do this, but an acquiring company is going to want that type of financial information. Um, you need a financial advisor. So whether it's a bank or just a financial advisor, an M&A advisor, somebody that is going to shepherd the process. Um, I highly recommend that. And then depending on the size of a potential exit, a private wealth manager, and I know that sounds kind of funny, but you need a different type of financial advisor on the personal side, particularly for founders and entrepreneurs, to guide some of the tax issues that you may have. And they've done this 1,000 times and may have recommendations for entrepreneurs on how to prepare, because this process can take anywhere from 3 months, if it's entirely very quick, to multiple years. So you have time to do all this.
Wow, well said. And I was gonna go into preparedness. I mean, you kind of nailed it on the tech side. Would you say that all of those translate across, the IPO, the exit with the government contracting business, all the way to this tech marketplace concept? Would you say that those kind of go across all three? Are they similar, or what's one or two pieces of being prepared that you could share across all of them?
So that those pieces of being prepared always translate in
Yeah.
terms of an exit.
Yep.
And look, if you're running your business well, get it documented, put it down, right? In terms of what are you doing, you need to document that. And that's
Hmm.
just good practice anyways. If you're doing something that people like and you're growing and you have great customer um, growth and pickup, this is stuff that as you're bringing in new people to the company, they should see how you got there, just from an employee perspective. And it's that type of documentation will translate to like whether it's an IPO, in a prospectus, whether it's private equity acquiring or a strategic acquiring. These are all good habits to have that these acquiring companies are going to be interested in or going public. And then all these resources I just mentioned, depending all in any potential outcome, you need those resources.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I really like the private wealth management piece, because I think a lot of people don't anticipate the tax implications of these types of transactions. And like you said, people that have done it 1,000 times, they do it every day. Having someone like that in your corner is well worth it. I've talked to a few people that have mentioned it, but you're actually the first person that's mentioned it on the podcast as as a part of being prepared. So that's
I,
amazing.
I appreciate it. Say, look, it's not my first rodeo. I've made 1,000 mistakes, so I'm hoping to share some of the best practices, if you will. And having learned this over 22 years and multiple exits, it's not something that comes to mind. You think private wealth management, like, I may be making X, I may be making Y. It's not the first thing that comes to mind as you're in the throes of this process, which is 24/7, as you know, right? It's all consuming, very stressful, lots of negotiations. And thinking of the post exit is not exactly on a lot of entrepreneurs' mind, but
Mm,
having those folks that can give you the advice on a personal level is incredibly important because this is life changing, right? Whether
mm,
it's tiny or whether it's enormous, this is
yeah.
life changing. Talk to people that have given that advice before, and maybe because this is going to be a huge taxable event, they can give you some advice on how to best structure it and best practices.
Well said. Well said. Let's shift gears to timing. Across all three of these really various different types of exits that you've done, what would you say for somebody listening when the right time is? Every business is different, but you're very fortunate to have these different categories and industries. So, what could you share around timing?
So let me give you the three examples for me personally, and I think that they're applicable to timing for anyone in this process. So the first one, register.com, it was the first .com era, and we had an incredible business, again growing up to 100 million in revenue, actual revenue, and it was the time to go public, right? That in the late 90s, the iron was hot, so to speak. And so that's what you did. You struck when the iron was hot, and there was a huge investor appetite for that type of company. So that made sense there. With Facile, it's because the company was mature, and my business partner and I, for lack of a better word, were bored. We wanted to do something else. And if our heart wasn't in it and our heart was not in it, it was time to let a new generation take this over and see what they could do with it. With Get My Boat, the world changed for us in the summer of 2021. There was a lot of not only interest, but externally, there was some competitive components going on that changed our industry. And we had to look hard in the mirror. Could we continue the same way that we had been, which was, as I said, a small amount of strategic capital, but mainly bootstrapped? Or were we putting our company and employees at a disadvantage by not exploring options at that point, given the external events that had taken place? It was mainly one big competitor had been acquired by a huge growth equity firm.
Hmm.
And we were worried that we were going to be at a huge competitive disadvantage as a result. So that externality drove us to explore what our options were at the time.
Hmm.
So hopefully those three examples, those are three, will give listeners something to think about that may be applicable in their own situation.
Yeah, yeah, and they're so different. Like the three different businesses are so different, and I love conversations like these where true entrepreneurs looking in different spaces to learn from the ground up and solving a problem is what makes it fun. Like you mentioned the journey and everything like that. I really appreciate that characteristic in just its raw form is like, okay, I'm bored here. I'm gonna go do this, and I'm gonna learn everything there is and create a market with boating and all of that. And I think it's such a great example of entrepreneurship, and scaling it all the way to an exit is kind of that top 0.1%, of businesses. So it's really cool. So that leads us to the finale. Knowing what you know now, what would you tell Sascha 10 years ago?
Well, I appreciate it. I'm a little older than that, so I'm going to go back kind of towards more the beginning of this journey, if you will.
Okay.
But I appreciate the 10-year comment. So um, I have learned over these few decades that companies, and this may sound funny, but companies are bought, they're not sold. And in today's environment, and certainly you see it today in everything you read about tech companies, right? They're putting themselves up for sale. This is the absolute worst time to be going to the market. And you put yourself at a huge disadvantage because people are going to try and take advantage of that valuations are low. But what I mean by that is you can put yourself up for sale. And certainly we did that with Facile when we thought we were in a very strong, advantageous position. And certainly private equity is doing that all the time. They're putting companies up for sale. What I've learned in our experience is the interest kind of will drive the valuation. It'll drive a potential successful exit to completion. If somebody is interested in acquiring your company, it generally means that they're going to put the time and resources in and um, be willing to negotiate and get through the hard periods of a negotiation to acquire your company. I didn't know this previously. I thought that it was much more dynamic and that if you ran a good business, you could put it up for sale and there'd be a lot of, you could run a process and people would be interested in buying it. That's certainly the case. I'm not, this is just take one person's bit of advice. But if you really want a successful outcome, I think you put yourself in the best situation by having suitors that approach you. And this happens over years, right? So when we entered the process for Get My Boat, we went back to people that had previously been interested and said, would you be interested again at this point? And they generally are.
Mhm.
But that is something I've learned kind of the hard way, um, and what I'd like to pass on to people.
Nice. Very nice. Good tips. So that leads us to what you're doing now. I mean, you really have you transitioned out of Get My Boat, or what are you working on now?
No, so a huge part of the deal and the exit, so to speak, with Get My Boat was that I stay on. And so
Hmm.
we were actually majority acquired, which means that a bunch of us still have a bunch of equity in Get My Boat by Yanmar, who was our strategic investor. They wound up acquiring a majority. We've worked with them for 7 years. They were very generous from that perspective. They're very generous by putting growth capital in the business, finally, to allow us to realize our vision of where we want to be. But a key component of this, and this is another lesson for potential entrepreneurs, is they mandated that I stick around and
Hmm.
continue to run the business. It worked for me. I wasn't ready to exit. I wasn't ready to start working on something else. To have growth capital and a very patient partner to allow us to realize the vision, as well as have liquidity, was truly. You look at this opportunity. I'm very very grateful to Yanmar and the people I worked with there, but it is incredibly unique from that situation. So I'm still here. I'm here for at least a couple more years, and as I tell people at this point, I'm just very grateful and thankful to be where I'm at and do what I do each day. I feel very fortunate.
Nice. Well said. Well said. Well, where can people go and follow you and learn more?
So I'm not a huge social media person, and Steve, as we talked about, I don't do a lot of interviews, or podcasts. But I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me Sascha Mornell on LinkedIn. You can find me sashmornell.bio. Feel free to reach out to me, Sascha at getmyboat.com, if you want to email, and we can always just start there and see where that takes
Awesome.
us.
Awesome. Well, wherever you guys are listening on iTunes or Spotify, the links that Sascha mentioned will be in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming.
Steve, I really appreciate it. Thanks.